following content may contain visuals that are disturbing, graphic, or sensitive in nature. Viewer discretion is advised. This material is intended for mature audiences and may not be suitable for all viewers. Please exercise caution while watching, and if you find such content distressing, we recommend discontinuing viewing. This disclaimer is provided to ensure awareness and to prioritize viewer well being.
Joining me now on News9 Live is a special guest from Israel. I am now joined for this exclusive conversation by Eylon Levy, the spokesperson for the Israeli government. Mr. Levy, thank you so much for joining us here on News9 Live.
Thank you for having me on the show, Neha.
Lovely to have you at what is obviously an incredibly busy and challenging time for you and your country. Let's begin by talking about the latest videos that have been released by the Israeli Defense Forces. The Israeli army says the video footage shows the first solid evidence of a sophisticated Hamas tunnel network underneath Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza. There is a lot of curiosity about these tunnels. Could you share with us some details of what exactly has been found in these tunnels?
Yeah, this is really shocking. Everyone knows that under international law, hospitals must be protected. You're not allowed to use them for military purposes. But Hamas has a deliberate strategy of using hospitals and civilians as human shields and hiding behind them. Now, for the last month, we've been warning that the Shifa hospital in Gaza was in fact Hamas's main headquarters, that they were hiding in the basement, hiding in the tunnels under that hospital. And now the evidence is plain for all to see. Yesterday, the IDF released a video showing a tunnel shaft 10 meters deep. There's a spiral staircase. And at the bottom of the staircase is a 55-meter-long tunnel. And at the end of that tunnel is something you don't find in most hospitals. It's a blast door with a firing hole in it. Hamas has, in complete violation of international law and morality, been hiding underneath hospitals, been using ambulances to transport its terrorists. We have a rocket siren. I have to go, I'm afraid.
Mr. Levy, we're relieved to have you back. Are you safe? Is your entire team safe? What just happened there?
Yes, this is the third time I've had to interrupt a news interview because of a missile attack on Tel Aviv. And this time we just had a massive barrage at the whole of central Israel that forced 2 million people to run into their rocket shelters. When terrorists from the Gaza Strip fire rockets at Israel, we in Tel Aviv have a minute and a half to run for safety. We all hear a rocket siren and you have to get into an underground rocket shelter if you can. If you don't have an underground rocket shelter, you need to stand in the stairwell. And if it catches you outside, you have to lie on the ground with your hands above your head. Since the beginning of the war with Hamas on October 7th, with the massacre, we've had over 10,000 rockets that have been fired at Israeli towns at all hours. Unfortunately, we're used to this. But of course, every time that there is a rocket attack like that, it scares a lot of people. Sometimes we're not able to shoot down those rockets and they end up hitting a building and even causing loss of life and killing people. And it's a reminder, it's a reminder of one of the reasons why in this war we have to destroy Hamas. We have to remove Hamas from power, because it wasn't just the October 7th massacre. It wasn't just that brutal, sadistic massacre of 1,200 people on October 7th. It has been nearly 20 years that Hamas has been terrorizing the people of Israel with rocket fire whenever they want, pressing a button and sending millions of Israelis into rocket shelter. And it's that reign of terror that we're going to end.
Well, that has got to be scary, and we're glad that you're safe. 10,000 rockets have been fired at Tel Aviv since the 7th of October. Typically,
at the whole of Israel from Gaza.
At all of Israel. Typically, how often does this happen in a single day when you have to run into a bomb shelter?
There have been days where we've had to run a few times into bomb shelters. At the moment, because the Israeli army has taken over Gaza City, we've pushed the Palestinian terrorists south in the Gaza Strip, and that means that most of their 75-kilometer rockets, Tel Aviv is no longer in range. But we know that they've spent years preparing for this war with so much Iranian money that has been poured into Hamas's war machine instead of civilian needs inside Gaza. So they're prepared and they have very long-range rockets that can be fired at us at any hour they want. And that's what we're determined to end, so that they can terrorize our people no longer. In every round of conflict with Hamas, Israel says there is no country in the world that would tolerate terrorists being able to fire rockets at its cities, and every conflict ends with a ceasefire, and then 6 months later, a year later, Hamas starts shooting rockets. No, enough is enough. This time it ends. This time the war will end with Hamas and the Gaza Strip no longer able to pose a security threat to the people of Israel.
Enough is enough. This time it ends, you're saying. If I could just go back for a moment to, the issue of the tunnels, whose video was posted by the Israeli Defense Forces on Sunday. We see a tunnel shaft. We see, a blast-proof door there. There is clearly evidence of tunnels, something that I think has been widely known for a long time. But do you believe that Israel has enough evidence that proves that the tunnels underneath Al-Shifa hospital house a Hamas command and control center?
You're right. This is really shocking. It is illegal under international law to use hospitals for military purposes. And Hamas has a deliberate strategy of hiding under hospitals, under schools, under mosques, under people's homes, using them as human shields, because they know that makes it very difficult for Israel to target the monsters who perpetrated the October 7th massacre. That's why we've been urging people to get out of the way, civilians, so that we can target Hamas. Now look, it's been an open secret for many years that Hamas uses the basement of the Shifa hospital as a main command center. But over the last few days, we have been unearthing concrete evidence, literally concrete evidence, showing that Hamas built a command center underneath that hospital. The IDF released footage showing a spiral staircase that goes down 10 meters underground, leading to a 55-meter long tunnel, leading to a blast door with a firing hole. Now, we don't find many blast doors like that in Israeli hospitals. I'm sure you don't have them in India. There's only one explanation, and that's to host a terrorist headquarters underneath the hospital. And we expect that in the days and weeks and months to come, we're going to show more evidence about Hamas, how Hamas exploited those hospitals. And I have to say, a lot of the international agencies that have been operating inside the Gaza Strip, including those that belong to the UN, look very, very, very silly now. As people ask them questions, what did you know? Why did you not say anything? Do you really expect us to believe that Hamas built this whole city under a hospital and you knew nothing and you were quiet?
Okay, so let me ask you this. The war has now entered its 7th week. Which of its stated objectives would you say Israel has managed to achieve thus far?
Well, we're working towards two main objectives in this war in response to the October 7th massacre, that brutal massacre of 1,200 Israelis on October 7th. The first is to totally destroy Hamas's terrorist and governing infrastructure inside the Gaza Strip. And the second is to bring home our hostages, 240 people, including over 30 children, including babies. There's a 10-month-old baby who is a hostage of Hamas in a dark tunnel, and we want to bring them home. Now, as for destroying Hamas's terror infrastructure, we've been very successful in the last few weeks. We've struck thousands of targets. We've killed thousands of terrorists, and that will continue. As for bringing our hostages home, of course, it's day 45 of the war. We wish that we could have brought them home safe already to their families. And our estimation is that continuing to put pressure on Hamas, military pressure and diplomatic pressure from our allies, that is the way to make sure that Hamas releases our hostages. Clearly, they weren't going to do that if we stood by the sidelines and sent them an email and asked them nicely. We're putting pressure on Hamas, and the plan is to force Hamas to release our hostages so that those children, those innocent civilians, our men and women in uniform, can come back safely to their families.
All right, you're talking about hostages. Now, Israel's ambassador to the US, Michael Herzog, has said there's a strong possibility that more hostages could be released under a new deal with Hamas very soon. It could happen as early as this week. Could you tell us something about that?
I can't comment on sensitive negotiations when human lives are at stake. You'll understand these are very sensitive issues, and the less we say, the better. But of course, we hope that those hostages who have been held in inhumane conditions by the terrorists who massacred, butchered, burned, and raped their way through their villages and through that music festival on October 7th. We hope that they are safe, we hope that they are healthy, and we hope to bring them home.
We hope so too. In fact, a baby was born to a hostage 2 days ago.
Which is really, really horrific and just shows you the inhumanity of Hamas to abduct, a pregnant woman, a heavily pregnant woman, and force her to give birth in a tunnel, if that is true that she has already given birth so far, just tells you about the sheer, pure evil that we are dealing with. These are not human beings. These are not people with any sense of morality or a conscience. We're fighting monsters. We're fighting monsters.
Well, clearly what they did to Israelis on the 7th of October revealed that they are monsters, and it was nothing but butchery. And fact of the matter is, they don't seem to care about the lives of their own people either. But is it now foregone? Is it now a foregone conclusion, Mr. Levy, that the war will expand from northern Gaza to southern Gaza? And if the answer is yes, of course, people will ask, where do the Palestinians go then? Because the Egyptians are not taking them.
Yes, this war will continue into the south of the Gaza Strip because we will destroy the whole of Hamas's terror and governing infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. We will not go back to 6 a.m. on October 7th. We will not go back into a world in which Hamas can invade our country at will and burn whole families alive, behead people, torture children in front of their parents, parents in front of their children. That will not happen, and that is why we will destroy Hamas. Now, it's very sad that Hamas has spent the last 16 years in power. Instead of serving the people of Gaza, instead of building peaceful and prosperous lives for them, it spent that time hiding under its schools, under its homes, under its hospitals, under its mosques, to try to shield itself from Israel's defensive efforts. And anywhere that Hamas is operating is not safe. And that is why we are urging civilians to get out of harm's way. It's why we've been operating humanitarian corridors that have been attacked by Hamas to get civilians out of harm's way. Now, we've designated specific humanitarian zones, safe zones, where we hope the international community will be able to deliver humanitarian aid, food, medicine, water, tents, so that the people of the Gaza Strip can remain safe from Hamas's own attempts to put them in harm's way. It's very, very sad that we're in this situation, that Israel is doing everything it can to minimize civilian casualties inside Gaza, while Hamas is doing everything it can to maximize those casualties. As I said, we're dealing with an evil, sick, twisted enemy, and those are the conditions and the constraints that we're operating under, and we're doing the best we can.
I don't doubt for a minute that this is an evil force. But let me ask you this question. A Reuters poll recently said that over 75% of the global protests that have been held in recent weeks have been anti-Israel and pro-Palestine. Would you agree that another major challenge that Israel currently faces is the fast-changing sentiment around the world against the Israeli counter-offensive in Gaza, given that at least 13,000 Palestinians have now been killed? So are you concerned about the growing international pressure that Israel faces today?
You know, those protests didn't begin when Israel started defending itself from Hamas. Those protests began when the massacre began. People forget, but on October 7th, we saw jubilation and celebration from supporters of Hamas all around the world who said that this brutal massacre of children, of babies, was an act of liberation and an act of resistance. Those protests started off as celebrations at the brutal murder of Jews and Israelis in our country. So it doesn't surprise us that after so many years of anti-Semitism, of hatred of Jewish people, that people are protesting because they support what Hamas did or don't think that Israel should defend itself. But it doesn't matter how many hateful people and apologists for Hamas's war crimes take to the streets around the world, we will not leave our hostages in Gaza and Hamas in power, because Hamas is telling us that it will do this again. Hamas is promising a second October 7th, and a third October 7th, and a fourth, and a million October 7ths until they have killed every man, woman, child in this country. That is the threat we are facing. And the people who are calling for a ceasefire are telling Israel that it has no right to defend itself. They're telling Israel that Hamas should literally get away with murder, that Hamas should be free to reoffend, and that Hamas should reoffend, and that Israel has no right to defend its people. And we're standing up against that. We're standing up for humanity. We're saying that democratic states, countries that come under such brutal attack by terrorists, have every right and every obligation to protect their people by eliminating the terrorists who did this so they can never do it again, and to make every effort to bring back those 240 hostages who have been held without access to the Red Cross, without any communications with their family, in inhumane conditions for 45 days and counting.
So let me ask you this, Mr. Levy, because the world is asking this question. Are you completely ruling out a ceasefire at this point, despite all the international pressure, including from countries like France and Canada, and of course repeated calls from the United Nations?
There will be no end to this fighting that leaves our hostages in Gaza and Hamas in power. This war will end with the return of our hostages. We're not going to abandon our babies in the Gaza Strip. And this war will end with the total destruction of Hamas. That's something that the United States, France, you mentioned, other Western governments are all in complete agreement. This war must end with the destruction of Hamas. The free world cannot allow terrorist groups to use territory as a base for brutal attacks. This was the deadliest terror attack in world history after 9/11, and to get away with it. So we're going to keep fighting until we bring back our hostages, until we've destroyed Hamas. We know that it's the most moral fight imaginable to protect our people from these atrocities. And we know that the free nations of the world are behind us. And they understand that this time we've got to finish the job and we've got to end Hamas.
Though the French President Emmanuel Macron has repeatedly called for a ceasefire, and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau only recently said the killings of women and children in Gaza must stop. You want to say something to that?
These are deeply regrettable comments. I think the Canadian Prime Minister knows full well that Israel is targeting Hamas and goes above and beyond its obligations in trying to get civilians out of harm's way. We see these very sad images on our TV screens because Hamas decided to declare war from inside a densely populated area. Densely populated areas, we're trying to get civilians out of the way because we don't want them to be hurt. But they also understand this war has to end with the total destruction of Hamas. Now, as for a temporary ceasefire, if we can secure a massive release of our hostages, then a small pause in the fighting is something that we would consider. But we will not allow Hamas to reoffend. We will not leave Hamas in a position where it can invade at any time it wants and burn whole families, butcher people, behead them, torture, mutilate, rape them. I mean, really, the atrocities we saw on October 7th were some of the most horrific war crimes that you can imagine. And we expect the whole world, especially the free world, to stand shoulder to shoulder with us, as they've been doing, even though the images on our TV screens are very difficult and we hold Hamas fully accountable for them, to stand shoulder to shoulder with us as we eradicate this evil and bring security to the people of Israel and new opportunities for the Palestinian people who have been oppressed by Hamas for too long and also deserve a future without that terror group controlling their lives.
Okay. Mr. Levy, in a major development, the leaders of many Arab and Muslim-majority countries are gathering in Beijing in an attempt to pressure both Israel and the US to agree to a ceasefire. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, the Palestinian Authority, Indonesia, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, they're all there. How do you see this?
Well, look, we know that public sentiment in Arab countries has always been hostile to Israel. That's regrettable. We want normalization and peace for the whole region. Our hand is extended in peace to all the nations of the Middle East. Unfortunately, not all of our neighbors want that friendship with us. But we know that Arab countries around the region understand that Hamas has to go. And by the way, US Secretary of State Tony Blinken has said this as well, that from his conversations with Arab leaders, they understand that Hamas has to go. And that's because the moderate Arab countries in the Middle East understand that we're up against the same enemy, that Iran, the Iranian regime, which sponsors Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, other militias in Syria and Iraq, these are the enemies of peace and normalization and prosperity in the Middle East. They are trying to destabilize the region, to export their own violent version of religious extremism. And they understand that ultimately Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, ultimately we are all on the same side against the Iranian axis of aggression, even if public pressure may make it very difficult for them to say that out loud.
Well, most do believe that Iran was the architect of October 7. But I have to ask you this. The United Nations has said that Israeli forces have targeted hospitals, schools turned shelters, and even UN centers, something that is totally prohibited under the international humanitarian law. Would you want to respond to that?
these are outrageous accusations from a world body that, I'll remind you, has not condemned Hamas's atrocities on October 7th, has not demanded the immediate, safe, and unconditional return of our hostages. Unfortunately, we've seen several international institutions that have been complicit with Hamas's strategy of human shields, that knew that Hamas was exploiting hospitals, that knew that Hamas was exploiting ambulances, that knew that Hamas was hiding in civilian areas, and decided to say absolutely nothing and to attack Israel instead. So we think that the behavior of these international institutions has been shameful. We think there needs to be global accountability from the international officials and agencies on the ground in the Gaza Strip, because there is no way that they did not know how Hamas was exploiting those civilian infrastructures for military purposes. We think they owe the world some answers, and we think they're beginning to look very, very, very silly as the extent of Hamas's takeover of those areas becomes clear and they continue to attack Israel instead of holding Hamas to account as they should.
Okay, interesting. You're saying it's agencies like the UN that need to be held accountable. But,
100%.
Okay, let me ask you this. Since the ground offensive began, correct me if I'm wrong, Israel has lost 65 soldiers. So how much longer do you think this war will continue? I know you've said, and the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister have said, we're going to wipe Hamas off the face of this planet. But in substantive terms, at what point is Israel going to say we have completely achieved our objective and the war can come to an end?
We've set deadlines, not timetables. This war will unfortunately take as long as it needs. Not a day more, not a day less. You know, we too want to end this war. We have 350,000 people in reserves. We want them home. We want to go back to the task of rebuilding our country after the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust on October 7th. But we need to end this war in a way that makes sure Hamas cannot attack us again. Because if we don't finish this job, if we don't finish off Hamas, we're going to find ourselves in the same cycle of violence. If we don't finish off Hamas, then Hamas will attack us in another 6 months and we're going to have to pick up this war again. We want to end the cycle of violence. And you know, as much as I enjoy being in these TV studios and being interviewed by you, if we end this war before we destroy Hamas, that's just a guarantee that you and I are going to be talking on TV in another 6 months when Hamas attacks us and we're forced to defend our people again. So we've said enough. No more getting dragged into conflicts with Hamas every 6 months, every year. This was the straw that broke the back of a very strong camel. This time it ends. This time Hamas ends.
That was the last straw. Last couple of questions, Mr. Levy, before we let you go. What happens once the war is over? Let's say you do manage to completely eliminate Hamas. Who takes control of Gaza? What would be an acceptable alternative for you?
We have three main principles for what must happen in the Gaza Strip the day after Hamas, which again is not in the immediate future, but three main principles. The first is that the Gaza Strip must be completely demilitarized. It can never again be allowed to host a terrorist group that can fire tens of thousands of rockets at our cities, invade us, butcher our people, abduct them. The Gaza Strip will never again pose a security threat to Israel. That's one. But the second thing is maybe more important. The Gaza Strip must be de-radicalized. We cannot have another generation of Palestinian children growing up and being taught in schools to hate Jews, to destroy the state of Israel, to pursue jihad and martyrdom instead of building peaceful lives. And that is what Hamas has done in its 16 years of power with the support and complicity of UN agencies like UNRWA. After the Second World War, you know why the Second World War didn't radicalize the people of Germany or Japan? It's because the Allies de-radicalized Germany and Japan and made sure that they are now prosperous, powerful democratic countries and Western allies. The same has to happen in the Gaza Strip, or a new terror group is going to come up and attack Israel if we do not end this religious extremism. And the third point is rebuilding Gaza. The Gaza Strip will have to be rebuilt in a way that makes sure that the concrete this time goes to people's houses and not into those tunnels that we're uncovering under the Shifa hospital right now.
And who takes over from Hamas? Is Palestinian Authority an alternative, you think?
We're exploring several options with our partners, The Palestinian Authority is very problematic because the Palestinian Authority also incites hatred against the state of Israel, also denies that Israel has a right to exist. I'll tell you, this sounds crazy. The Palestinian Authority pays salaries to terrorists who are sitting in Israeli jails. If a terrorist takes a knife and stabs Israelis in the street, they will get paid by the Palestinian Authority for the rest of their lives. That is direct incentive for terrorism. And we think whoever works the day after Hamas to rebuild the Gaza Strip needs to be a force that fights terrorism, not funds terrorism.
Okay, so you're not comfortable with the Palestinian Authority either, and therefore the question remains, can there really be a void or a vacuum, especially now that your Prime Minister has made it clear that we have no intentions of reoccupying Gaza? He did controversially say at one point that we're going to have a security responsibility for an indefinite period of time, but then he clarified later we have no intentions of reoccupying Gaza. Is that correct?
Exactly. Israel does not want to reoccupy the Gaza Strip. We don't want to govern it. You know, in 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip. We pulled out. People forget this. In 2005, we gave the keys of the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians and told them, good luck, you can govern the Gaza Strip now. And in exchange, we got rockets. And the little Palestinian children who were born when Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip are now old enough to be Hamas terrorists. And the youngest Israeli children who were born when Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip are now soldiers who are having to go into Gaza to protect us from Hamas. So we don't want to go and control the Gaza Strip, but the Gaza Strip must be demilitarized. And we will need to have ultimate security control to ensure that the Gaza Strip does not allow a buildup of a terror group able to attack our people again. We wish this weren't the case. We wish this weren't the case. But we know that we're going to have to defend ourselves.
And you are saying that this will be in the long term, Israel having security responsibility of Gaza. This is in the long term?
Certainly for the foreseeable future, until Gaza is completely demilitarized, de-radicalized and rebuilt in a peaceful way, we're going to need assurances that the Gaza Strip can't export terrorism. By the way, with this, we see completely eye to eye with the US administration. President Biden wrote a very powerful column in the Washington Post in which he explained whatever happens in Gaza the day after Hamas, Gaza and the West Bank must never again be allowed to be bases for terrorism against the Israeli people. And we look forward to working with our international partners to work out how exactly we do that.
And of course, President Biden is also at pains to say reoccupying Gaza would be a big mistake. He has given that advice to his friend.
And that is not something that we want to do. As I said, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005. We gave it to the Palestinians to govern their own lives, and we have no interest in governing them for them.
Okay. You know, you said we have to finish off this religious extremism. Many have argued that Hamas is not just a terror organization, it's an ideology. While you can wipe out a terror organization, perhaps, can you stamp out an ideology?
You're right. It is not only a terrorist group, it is also an ideology. But a decade ago, when 86 nations came together and built a coalition to fight ISIS, to fight Daesh in Syria and Iraq, they didn't think they were going to defeat an ideology. They said they were going to deny that ideology a territorial base from which to commit attacks against people all around the world. And that's what we're doing here. We're denying a terrorist group with an extremist ideology a territorial base to commit attacks. We'll destroy Hamas just like the world destroyed ISIS. But we're also saying that the day after Hamas, in order to stop this violence from reoccurring, the whole international community needs to send the Palestinians a very clear message. The state of Israel has a right, an inalienable right to exist within sovereign borders. And when you teach Palestinian children that the state of Israel has no right to exist, because that's what they're teaching them, when they tell them that their job is to grow up and, quote, liberate Palestine from the river to the sea and wipe out the state of Israel, they are raising up the next generation of children to support terrorism or to be terrorists as well. And we're saying that if we're going to stop finding ourselves in the same cycle of violence with a new terrorist organization, the world is going to have to be serious about de-radicalizing Palestinian society and telling them hard truths. The state of Israel exists, it has a right to exist, it's not going anywhere, and you need to live with it.
Okay, final question, Mr. Levy, before we let you go. You've categorically stated Israel's objectives as far as this war is concerned. But I'm going to ask you this, that of course what happened on the 7th of October was absolutely horrific beyond words, and unimaginable butchery, really. But 7 weeks into this war, 1,200 Israelis were butchered on the 7th of October. But now 12 to 13,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. We are told thousands of them were women and children. Are you concerned that the mood of the world is changing and that as calls grow for a ceasefire, as criticism of Israel's actions in Gaza grows, there is going to be greater pressure on you with every passing day? You do acknowledge that,
First
right?
of all, the images of humanitarian suffering in the Gaza Strip as a result of Hamas declaring war on us with the October 7th massacre are, of course, deeply upsetting. No one denies that, and we hold Hamas completely responsible and accountable for waging an unnecessary war with a brutal act of terrorism and fighting that from inside civilian areas. Now, the numbers that you are quoting are the numbers provided by Hamas. You are quoting numbers that were provided by the terror organization that on October 7th burned, beheaded, abducted babies, and then lied about all of it. So there is no reason to take even at face value the numbers that are being given to you by a terrorist organization that denies the atrocities that it perpetrated on October 7th. It provides those numbers. How many Hamas terrorists does it say were killed? If you listen to the Hamas authorities, they'll tell you they were all civilians. They don't admit that we have been going after and killing their fighters. Now look, Hamas has a deliberate strategy of maximizing civilian casualties on its own side because it knows that when it produces images of civilians being hurt, it gets global sympathy, and that puts pressure on Israel to stop. That's why Hamas actually stopped civilians in northern Gaza from evacuating. We spent a month saying, please get out of harm's way. We don't want you to be hurt. And Hamas held them at gunpoint and stopped them from evacuating while it hid under schools, mosques, hospitals, and people's homes. So Hamas is playing a sick strategy where it's trying to maximize Palestinian civilian casualties in order to generate sympathy, in order to generate pressure on Israel. And we know that many people are upset by these images and will be demanding that Israel cease fire. But as I said, we will not abandon our 240 hostages in Gaza, and we will not leave Hamas free to attack us again. Because if we don't finish the job this time, Hamas will attack us again, and we'll find ourselves in the same war in 6 months' time, in a year, and this will go on and on and on until we finish the job, until we destroy Hamas. This time, Hamas left us no choice.
Hamas left Israel no choice. Well, I guess the world does want to see an end to this war at the earliest.
And
Eylon
so
Levy.
do we. And we want
Yes.
to end this war in a way that makes sure that it doesn't start again. We want to end this war in a way that makes sure that Hamas can't attack our people again. Believe me, we have suffered enough. We have bled enough. We want this war to end, but we want this war to end in a way that makes sure the monsters who perpetrated October 7th can't do it a second time, just like they're promising they will do.
All right. On that note, Eylon Levy, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.